Greetings, Modoverse, and welcome to part 2 in our two-part series covering 3D printing and Modo. My name is Kevin Hand. I'm a creative specialist for Foundry, and I'll be your presenter on this episode of Modo Not Monday. We're back in Modo 13.1, and just like before, where we used our dragon model as the example for FDM 3D printing, I've gone ahead and I've imported in our gargoyle model, which will be our second example for SLA 3D printing. I've gone ahead and I've taken a few steps forward on this, and I went ahead and run mesh cleanup on this model, as well as detriangulated the polygons on the base. And I've also gone ahead and run a couple of Boolean ops to get our supports and the gargoyle merged into the base itself. So now it is officially one solid piece and is good for print for either an FDM 3D printer or an SLA 3D printer. But now what I really want to talk about and focus on for this section of the video is how we can approach making this model hollow in order to make the most out of our resin in our vat, so we're not wasting a lot of resin. And one way to do that is determining the scale of the model and how big it is that we want to print. So if we take a look at the model here as is, and we can come over here to our dimensions tool, and with our model selected in item mode, we can see that it's just shy of 1.5 inches tall. Okay, that's great for game boards and various things or whatever we may be using this for. But maybe we want this to be larger. Maybe we made something similar to this. So at 1.5 inches tall, you could print this as one solid piece and let it be just a solid block of resin. And you would be okay with that because ultimately this isn't very large and it's not going to use that much resin. However, if we did want this to be taller or larger in any form or fashion, we would probably want to hollow this out, as that's a general rule of thumb and a fairly good method of practice to take on preparing a model for SLA 3D printing. So you're not wasting resin, in other words. Like I mentioned before in the previous video, resin, while it isn't necessarily super expensive, it isn't for free. And depending on the make, the brand of the resin, who makes it, and the type of resin, it can get relatively expensive. So we're going to stick with making this larger, and let's just say 3 inches. So we'll just double its height in the Y. And we can easily do that by going to our absolute scaling tool again. And the uniform scale, we'll set this to 3 inches on its longest axis, which is the Y axis. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and start this off by going to 3 inches. And we'll hit uniform scale. And just like that, we now have our model at 3 inches tall. So if I go back to item mode and reselect my dimensions tool, now we can see it's 3 inches tall. And this can be any scale that you want. So you have to take into account your printer volume as well. So if you've got a small printer volume, maybe 3 inches is getting close to its max. If you wanted to maybe separate both of these out and print both of them separate, you could do that as well. Right? And as with anything in 3D, there's a multitude of ways that we can approach this for hollowing it out. So I'm going to separate this out into two pieces, the base and then the gargoyle itself. On how we can approach creating the interior of our gargoyle model here. And one way that I prefer to do it is to make use of Modo's auto retopology tool. So the first thing that I want to do before anything is I want to just go through here and select this very bottom loop. And I want to hit Z on the keyboard, and I just want to extend this down. And then what I want to do is just make sure it's flat on the Y. And lastly, I just want to create an N-gon there and hit P on the keyboard. And now I'm ready to go. Okay. So with my layer selected here, and I come over here to geometry and come down to automatic retopology. Okay. Because I know I don't need all this detail on the geometry itself, I prefer to set it to absolute, and then I tell Modo what I want the polygon target to be. In most cases, I found 1,000 to be just about right. And the only other thing that I generally make sure on is just make sure that you have new mesh created. Okay, so if I click OK, just like that, I now have a fairly nice low-res model that will work on the inside. Okay, now one thing that we definitely want to do is an area like this is we just want to make sure this is, you know, cleaned up and pretty much ready to go as is. It should be fairly close, but generally we just want to make sure, give it a good once over, and fix any kind of errors that might be present. Yeah, something like that. And then generally what I like to do is I like to select the bottom here, and we can make use of our coplanar selection tool again, and make sure we have all these on the bottom. And then I like to give this a selection set just so I can easily select it whenever I want to. So we'll just call that bottom. And let's also just make sure it's flat. Yeah, it is. Okay. And now we're good to go with that. Okay. So now what we can do is we can just take these polygons and we can give this a negative 1 millimeter, let's say 1.1 millimeter shift. And if I turn our gargoyle exterior model on, now we can pretty much see exactly what we're wanting to see, which is the interior of our model, right? We have our high res as our background and our lower res interior as our foreground. So we can see that nice and clear. Now we haven't flipped these polygons yet. And the main reason for that is we basically just want to come through, and any issues that we see like here and here where the interior model is kind of protruding through the exterior model, we want to fix that, because again, we don't want anything intersecting or pushing through to our exterior model. It'll see it as a whole when it goes to print. And so another set of tools that I like to use for this is Modo's brush tools. And if I select the push tool, I've already got it down to negative 30%. I can push my geometry away with my push tool here, just like so. All right. Now, one thing that I personally like to do, and you don't have to, you can take it for what it is I like to have my low poly model in subdivision mode. And the reason for that is I find it a little bit easier to kind of see what's protruding and what's not, where I need to fix some things and where I don't, right? And another thing that you just kind of want to keep an eye out for, and not that it'll necessarily be an issue, but I generally try to smooth some of this stuff out, and I do that using the smooth brush. And more often than not, the default settings work just about right for what I want. And all we want to do is just kind of smooth this out a little bit so it's not quite so pinched. polygon count doesn't matter when it comes to 3D printing. So you could freeze this at level 12 and go with it. And the printer software doesn't care. It doesn't care about poly count or polygon flow or any of that stuff. Only errors, right? And so what I generally do is I leave this in sub D mode, and I come over here and I just set both my subdivision and Catmull Clark to 2 or even 1 sometimes. And I'm working in Catmull Clark because I prefer Catmull Clark. But just as a rule of thumb, I generally like to just make sure and have both set to 2. And again, you could set it to 1. Come over here to geometry, hit freeze, make sure it's on faces, and good to go. And now we have our interior. So from this point, what I would do is, let me just go back into shaded view here, is I would flip these polygons inward so the printing software will know this is our interior. And from here, if I'm in item mode, duplicate these layers, and then take my original 3 layers and hide those, and use these 3 duplicated layers to create my final model for print. Okay, and you could also come in here if you wanted to, and you could assign this, say, a selection set. So we could call this interior, and just for kicks and giggles, we'll call this one base, and we'll call this one exterior. And what I want to do now is I just want to take my interior, and I'm going to cut that and paste it into my gargoyle mesh layer. And then I'm going to delete that empty layer. And then all I want to do is simply come over here, go to my Boolean tool and set that to union, and then let my gargoyle union into the base itself. Just like that. And then we can go ahead and run mesh cleanup again. Yep. Okay, I'll run it one more time just to make sure. Yep, no elements to clean. So I can now delete that gargoyle, and I can name this one Gargoyle Hollow. There's one more thing that we need to do to this before it's ready to go to print, and that's create drainage holes. And those are super easy to make, and the main reason you want those is that most resin 3D printers prints everything upside down. And so in other words, this area here would be your build plate. Everything from here down would be your vat of resin. And as the build plate pulls up after the laser cures your resin, your model essentially comes out of the vat upside down like so. Because this is hollow, any of that resin would then get stuck down inside here. And trust me, from personal experience, when you go to remove this off of the build plate, if you're printing it exactly flat and parallel against the build plate, that's quite a mess when all that resin comes running out all over the place, right? And you waste a lot of resin that then gets... So the easiest way to fix this is to add drainage holes. And for this type of model, you would want 2. You would want one here, and generally you want to put one as close to the very bottom of the model, if we're upside down, as possible. And you can do this relatively small. You could do a couple of holes, you know, through here, or maybe a couple on either side of his skull here or something. However you want to do it, that's completely up to you. So I'm going to make use again of geometry that already exists. I'm going to copy this ingon here as it's a disk. I'm going to paste it into a new layer, and I'm going to just start this off by recoloring this to red. Red generally signifies a Boolean operation, and that's what I'm going to be doing for subtraction Boolean operation. And I don't want it this big, obviously. I want it fairly small. So I'm going to come over here to my absolute scaling tool again, and I'm going to use explicit scale and set this to 4 millimeters. just like so, and then hit explicit scale. Okay, and now I'm just going to pull this down to about here, and then I'm just going to extrude it back up just far enough, well, just enough to know that I'm penetrating all the way through and going into the inside of our model. Since the point of it is any resin trapped inside of our interior here then drains out, right? So now I've got my first one here, and now I'm going to just duplicate this. I'm going to turn this one off for a minute, and I'm going to click grab size in my absolute scaling tool. And the y-axis doesn't matter so much. Mainly you just want this to be relatively smaller for the one at the head here. So we'll make this one 1. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So now I can close out of that tool, and I'm just going to rotate this. 45 works. Move it all the way up to here. I keep doing that. Something like this. And you just want to make sure that it's actually going all the way through both layers, the exterior and the exterior of your model. Okay, that's all you want. And for me, that's going to work for me. If I come back over here and I turn this on. Okay, so the last thing to do is basically just select our gargoyle mesh model here. We'll come back over here to polys, Boolean, and this time we'll subtract, and we'll subtract those drainage holes out. And now that's done. So if we close that or hide those, let's go ahead and run our mesh cleanup one more time. So now we have our drainage holes in the bottom here, and a drainage hole at the base of the neck and skull of our gargoyle. And we have our interior. So I've brought our model into Asura, and Asura is just one of many resin 3D printing applications available. This particular version came with the resin 3D printer that I own. And just like that software, if I click on one of these little buttons over here, I can drag through and I can have a visual look at what's happening with our model. And we can see that it's hollow, and we can see that we have our 1mm wall thickness. There are a few little areas, like right in through here, and maybe this through here a little bit, that could potentially be problem areas when it goes to print. More than likely, it probably wouldn't cause any issues. This here might definitely cause an issue. So this is the kind of thing that you want to look out for. Sometimes you just have to go back and tweak some of this and get it out to where you have a little more thickness in the wall layer there. Okay. One thing that we can do inside of this software, and is a fairly common practice for resin 3D printing, is we can rotate our model. Not always do you want to have your model parallel to the build plate itself. And more often than not, if you do any type of Google search, you'll actually see that the majority of resin 3D prints are at an angle of some sort. It might be 15, it could be 30, 45 degree angle, and so on, right? This could serve two purposes for us with our model here. And if I just go ahead and take this, and I'm just going to rotate this to say, yeah, something like that, right? And hit center. And just for display reasons, yep, that should be fine. I'm just going to generate some random supports. And these supports can be placed however I want them to be. And when you have your own 3D printer and your own software and stuff, you'll learn that you can do similar things, and you'll want to think about strategically placing your supports for print. However, the main point of this was to talk about this being at an angle. What happens is as our laser hits the resin and it cures our layers one layer at a time, this does slightly raise above the resin itself, allowing a little bit of air and making use of our drainage holes for any resin that's inside here to drain out properly. That's one reason. And the other reason is that at an angle, a lot of times those little thin areas aren't as big of an issue at this angle as they would be parallel to the build plate. Okay, now that's not always the case. That's not always to say that's the best way to go. Like this is just a little bit too thin for my liking. So for me, as I would go back into Modo, I would grab these few little polygons and just pull it out, 250 microns or something, just so that I know for a fact there's a significant amount of wall space here, right? So I've come back over here to Modo, and I've imported our gargoyle model that we were just looking at in Asura. Before we go, I wanted to share the last bit of information for you that I thought you might find useful, and that's creating printer volumes inside of Modo. It's really, really simple, and they can come in real handy if you're working on a model and you're not sure if it's going to fit inside of your printer volume, right? So depending on the 3D printer that you're looking at, printer volume is important for the type of application you intend on using it for. So if you're primarily focused on making jewelry or game pieces, then you might want a fairly small printer volume. Likewise, if you're working on, film props or something like that, like I tend to do, then you might want a medium size to a larger size. That's purely up to you. However, either way, inside of Modo, having your printer volume can be really, really useful to make sure that whatever model you're working on, whether it's your own or one that you've imported, will fit inside that volume and print properly. For my resin printer, I've got one here from my Moai printer, which is my resin 3D printer, right? It creates a simple box at origin and on the ground plane. And if I activate my Dimensions tool again, we see that I have a printer volume of 180 millimeters in the Y by 130 and 130 millimeters square, right? And it's super easy to do. As many of you know, inside of Modo, you can hit F5 on the keyboard, and that'll bring up your command history. And all of the commands that I used to create my scripts, I got from here. And there's a couple of ways that you can do scripting inside of Modo. You can come down here and you can click on the scripting button here, which will bring up your scripting area. And you can also create yourself your own little script to where if you're creating your script in a external package such as PyCharm or something like that, you can run your script, right? So there's a multitude of ways of doing it. You can also hit the record button here, or come up to system and come down to record macro, and you don't even have to do any Pythoning. You can do the record macro and creating the box however large you want, right? So just as an example, I'll briefly show you this, which is all the commands that I used to create my script. Okay, there's nothing special about this. I didn't have to do anything drastic. This is a really simple script to make, right? And with that said, this concludes part 2 of the 2-part series on 3D printing in Modo. Hopefully you've learned some things about 3D printing you may not have known before, and perhaps picked up a trick or two as well. I'll end this Modonaut session with a turntable showing the models we worked on in all of their 3D printed glory, and I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and happy 3D printing.